The subcommittee will come to order. After recognizing myself, Chairman Yoho, Ranking Member Deutsch, Ranking Member Sherman, each for our opening statements, I will then recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute. We will then hear from our witnesses, and without objection, the witnesses' prepared statements will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I'd like to remind audience members that disruption of committee proceedings is against the law and will not be tolerated, although wearing themed shirts while seated in the hearing room is permissible. Holding up signs or standing up during the proceedings is not. Any disruptions will result in a suspension of proceedings until the Capitol Police can restore order. Thank you, Mr. Police Officer. The chair now recognizes herself for such time as she may consume. Finally, the third time is the charm. After running into hurricanes from Mother Nature and an emergency tax reform retreat, the first 2 times that we scheduled this hearing, I'm glad that we can all finally convene this important and timely hearing. I thank our witnesses for their patience and their willingness to work with us and coordinate our schedules so that we can make this hearing finally happen. So without further ado, we've officially kicked off our budget hearing for Afghanistan and Pakistan in an effort to examine the new strategy the President announced 2.5 months ago. While I think many of us are interested in hearing is exactly what the details are in this strategy, how will it be implemented, what are the benchmarks for measuring success, how the President intends to use the resources available to implement this new strategy. What I did hear when the strategy was rolled out was a clear and decisive message that the United States is resolved to win, to defeat terror, and that we will not focus on artificial timelines for withdrawal. I think that's the approach we should be taking, reversing our previous message to the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and others that they can simply wait us out because we had already predetermined when we would leave. But we haven't seen or heard how we plan on doing this. We do know that this comes with an undefined and open-ended financial commitment by the United States, as we saw earlier this week when the administration sent up an amendment to the budget request for additional resources to support 3,500 more troops. I don't see how we can defeat these groups without the support of Pakistan. I know the President put an emphasis on Pakistan needing to demonstrate its commitment to civilization, to order, to peace, but the strategy was lacking on details on how we're going to get Pakistan to reverse course. Pakistan needs to quit hedging its bets and get fully on board with the U.S. and Afghanistan. But the strategy was short on details on exactly what tools we will use and how to convince Pakistan that its interests align with what we aim to achieve in Afghanistan and Pakistan is the correct move. Following her trip to Pakistan with Secretary Tillerson, Ambassador Wells, and welcome to you, stated that the administration, quote, laid out some very specific expectations of how Pakistan can help create the conditions that will help bring the Taliban to the table, end quote. I hope to hear some of those specific expectations, not just on bringing the Taliban to the table, but to address the use of Pakistan territory as terror safe havens. I support the President's determination to integrate all elements of American power, diplomatic, military, economic, and political, to protect our interests and achieve our objectives, particularly when it comes to leaning on our partners and allies to share the financial burden and to provide more troops. A safe, secure, and stable Afghanistan, free from terror groups, is in all of our interests. The United States should not be relied upon to bear the full burden. Others must contribute to our mutual success. But right now, I don't see that willingness from our partners, especially when it comes to contributing more troops to NATO's mission, and I think the administration hasn't quite gone into detail on how we can get this support. I'm also concerned that the new strategy isn't as clear when it comes to our commitment to Afghanistan's future and the U.S.-Afghan relationship. Since the year 2002, we have made a concerted effort to support and empower women in Afghanistan, and in recent years, we have seen that support start to be realized. Dr. Bera and I had the honor and privilege to host First Lady Ghani, former First Lady Bush, and members of the U.S.-Afghan Women's Council for a meeting with our committee members and members of the Caucus for Women's Issues last week in the Capitol. What we heard was that the United States has helped build a foundation for women and girls that has improved their lives. But now What we need is to take that to the next level, to build on previous successes, achieved in large part to the work of the U.S. Afghan Women's Council, help them scale up and meet long-term challenges. Women will have an important role to play in Afghanistan's future, and I hope to hear how our new strategy will leverage that to achieve even greater success. The President clearly defined winning as attacking our enemies, obliterating ISIS, crushing al-Qaeda, preventing the Taliban. But what is the strategy in which to do this? What is our plan for addressing the growing Iranian influence in Afghanistan? We didn't hear anything in the new strategy regarding Iran's military and financial support for the Taliban, or Qatar's continued support for the Taliban and likely other terror groups in the region. The President also said that we will work with the Afghan government only as long as we see determination and we see progress, that our commitment is not unlimited and our support is not a blank check, and the American people expect to see real reforms. I'm not sure that these are both on the same timeline, and I'm not sure that we can achieve our goals excuse me, without supporting the Afghan government. I'm also greatly concerned with what I see as a dangerous and tragic retreat when it comes to our counter-narcotics efforts in Afghanistan. The President's request for fiscal year 18 was nearly half of our actual expenditure on these operations in 2016. ISIS, al-Qaeda, and so many others finance their operations in large part through their illicit activities, most notably through the money they raise from drug trafficking. We cannot just defeat these terror groups kinetically. We need to take out their revenue streams. Without a commitment to counter narcotics, I don't see how we can totally defeat these groups. There are ideas in this new strategy that many of us can fully support, but we need to hear details on how we will achieve our objectives, and we need to know what benchmarks the administration is going to use to measure success. I hope to hear some of that from our patient panel today, and how the President's budget request will be leveraged to achieve our goals and fulfill this new strategy. And with that, I turn to the ranking member of our Middle East Subcommittee, Mr. Deutsch, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, and thanks, Chairman Yoho, for convening this important joint subcommittee hearing. Thanks, of course, to our witnesses here today from State and USAID, whom I fear are undervalued, underfunded, and underutilized in the current administration. 16 years, for 16 years, American soldiers have been sacrificing their lives in Afghanistan to secure the future of that country and to protect our citizens at home. Too often we forget this very simple truth, that while we sit here in comfort, our young men and women are risking everything for us. Just this weekend, we were sadly reminded of this when a Green Beret, Sergeant First Class Stephen Cribben, husband, son, and father of two, was killed in combat operations south of Kabul. This sacrifice, though, includes not just our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, but also our diplomats and our public servants bringing hope and opportunity through the critical work of the State Department and USAID. Yesterday, we held a hearing in this room on democracy and governance promotion in the Middle East. We cannot secure Afghanistan's future and an effective relationship with Pakistan that roots out terrorism and empowers civil society without these efforts. We went into Afghanistan 16 years ago in order to remove al-Qaeda, who had been provided safe haven under brutal Taliban rule. And we have since made tremendous gains in decimating al-Qaeda's core infrastructure and helping Afghans reclaim their country. We have seen great strides through improved democratic governance, promoting women's rights, better maternal and child health care, and increased access to education. Under the repressive Taliban rule before 2001, less than 1 million Afghan children were in school, and almost none of them were girls. Today, more than 9 million children are in school, and over 40% of them are girls. And USAID, which has already spent billions to promote good governance, economic growth, and access to education, just announced another $75 million project to print and distribute 135 million approved textbooks for grades 1 through 12 to all public schools in Afghanistan. The Afghan people are profoundly grateful for these efforts, and so are the members of this committee. In August, the Trump administration finally unveiled its strategy for Afghanistan and South Asia, aimed at maintaining these gains and ultimately bringing the war in Afghanistan to a close. Today, we have a critical opportunity to hear from the administration witnesses how that strategy will be implemented and what it means for the future of our relationships with Afghanistan and Pakistan. I hope our witnesses can also help explain the motivation and potential impact of this administration's alarming 40% decrease in the budget request for these two countries from last year. In his well-scripted strategy speech, President Trump said, "The men and women who serve our nation in combat deserve a plan for victory. They deserve the tools they need and the trust they have earned to fight and to win." I agree. But the very next day, Secretary Tillerson seemingly contradicted the president by saying that while we may not win on the battlefield, neither will the Taliban. And while winning the war in Afghanistan has always been an amorphous target, I would have hoped for a clearer explanation from this administration after its intensive strategy review. What is clear to me is that we are facing the very real risk of backsliding in Afghanistan. The last few weeks have been particularly tough with a number of brutal attacks, including a deadly shooting at a TV station in Kabul this weekend by an ISIS affiliate. U.S. defense officials have plainly described the current fight against a resurgent Taliban as a stalemate. The most recent SIGAR report shows that U.S.-backed Afghan government maintains control or influence over just 56% of the country's 400 districts, and that around 10% of Afghan civilians reside in areas under militant control or influence. So where do we go from here? There are those who believe that the only way to achieve a stable Afghanistan is through an unending American military presence on the ground. Others advocate for the immediate withdrawal of every last American troop, but serious security experts, I believe, understand a third way. The U.S. should continue supporting and strengthening the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces to ensure that it can one day function independently of foreign assistance.
The chair notes a disturbance of committee proceedings. The room will be in order. I formally request that those disrupting the committee stop their disruption. The committee will suspend while the Capitol Police restore order. Thank you, officer. Mr. Deutsch is recognized to continue.
The ANDSF must ensure that it can one day function independently of foreign assistance and U.S. leadership on the ground. Meanwhile, we need to create conditions on the ground that can bring about a negotiated political settlement where the Taliban understands that it can never win power through its military. But any political settlement cannot come at the expense of the human rights and basic dignity of the Afghan people. Ultimately, for this to be successful, the Afghan government must become accountable for its own future. A stable Afghanistan will require continued patience and consistent resources from Congress. Achieving success in Afghanistan will not be quick or easy, but we owe it to the Americans and Afghans who have sacrificed so much to get this right. I look forward to exploring with our witnesses how the U.S. can, in fact, get this right and address the ongoing challenges in Afghanistan, from Taliban insurgency, terrorism, corruption, economic stagnation, and narco-trafficking, as well as Pakistan's role in preventing terrorist groups from establishing safe havens. And I yield back the balance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deutsch. And now I'm pleased to yield 5 minutes for his opening statement to the chair of the Asia and the Pacific Subcommittee, Dr. Ted Yoho.
Good morning, and I thank Chairman Emeritus Ros-Lehtinen for spearheading this hearing. And it's nice to know that you're going to be looking down upon us as these hearings continue. Afghanistan and Pakistan continue to make up one of the United States' most complex foreign policy and security challenge. And sadly, in the 16 years of our conflict in Afghanistan, the broad strokes of the situation are strikingly unchanged. Though the previous administration attempted to bring a symbolic close to the combat mission in Afghanistan, in reality, America's longest war is still ongoing. American soldiers are still fighting and dying in Afghanistan, and the cancer of the Taliban and terrorist groups is metastasizing. Pakistan is still seen as both a key to resolving the conflict and shelter for our enemies. While he is no supporter of unending wars in the Middle East and South Asia, President Trump observed in his speech that the consequences of a rapid exit are both predictable and unacceptable. In announcing our new national strategy for the conflict, the President laid out an important truth that should have guided our policies all along, that despite the enormous costs, we can't leave without resolution. Doing otherwise would create a vacuum filled instantly by terrorist threats, not just to the United States, but to the free world. Our new strategy must include civilians as well as military efforts to secure a lasting victory in Afghanistan for the Afghanistan people. and a sustainable relationship with Pakistan. There are many important questions to be answered about how the Department of State and the U.S. Agency for International Development will work within the new strategy and contribute to its eventual success. The administration has proposed reconsolidating the special representatives for Afghanistan and Pakistan back into the Bureau of the South and Central Asia. I hope Ambassador Wells, the acting head of both offices, will share her thoughts whether this will increase operational efficiencies and contribute to more region-wide strategic thinking. I'm particularly interested in hearing more about whether this administration will tolerate Pakistan's aiding and abetting of terrorist groups within its borders. Pakistan has been one of the largest U.S. foreign assistance recipients in the post-9/11 period, but despite giving tens of billions of dollars in counter-terror assistance over the years, terrorist organizations continue to operate with impunity in Pakistan. We've seen some promising signs that this administration will no longer put up with Pakistan's friendliness towards terror groups, and I hope to hear this new posture is reflected throughout the budgetary planning. A broader question is how reduced resources will be redirected and whether the administration's reduced focus on nation building, which the President mentioned in his speech, plays into foreign assistance budgeting for Afghanistan and Pakistan. The administration's budget for these two countries reflects substantial cuts even to accounts which have a strong nexus to defense and security, including INCLE, NATO, and FMF. So I thank the witnesses for joining two subcommittees today to share their knowledge on these and other important questions, and for working with us on scheduling to hear this hearing, and I look forward to their testimony.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yoho. I now will recognize members for their opening statements, starting with Mr. Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Chairman Ros-Lehtinen and Chairman Yoho and Ranking Member Deutsch and Ranking Member Sherman for holding this joint subcommittee hearing exploring the President's plan for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today to discuss this critical set of issues. For 16 years, the United States military has been deployed to South Asia in response to the terrorist attacks of September 11th. Since the beginning of military operations in October of 2001, our nation's objectives have evolved several times, creating more and more uncertainty as to the future of Afghanistan and America's role in that country's continuing challenges. Most importantly, since October of 2001, nearly 2,400 American lives have been lost in military operations. We owe it to the brave men and women and their families who have made the ultimate sacrifice to clearly define what our nation's role is in Afghanistan and Pakistan. This includes a clear explanation of the President's plan for Afghanistan and Pakistan, detailing the strategy and mission, and what it will take in terms of resources and personnel to achieve the objectives set forth in that mission successfully. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today as they can help inform this process, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Rohrabacher of California.
I would hope that we are going to be doing things differently to achieve a different outcome. We have been there for 16 years. I've spent a lot of time in Afghanistan over my life and been involved in its policy. Madam Chairman, we've had the wrong policy. Obviously, it hasn't worked. And unless we are, for example, we mentioned going to hold Pakistan more accountable, unless we are going to eliminate poppy production, which we have not done, all of this time, there's Taliban are still making their money, hundreds of millions of dollars off opium production. We have not stopped that. We had the ability to do so. There are a number of things that needed to be done. We have written a constitution and foisted upon the people of Afghanistan that is totally contrary to their culture. And while it is important for us to defeat the forces of radical Islam, including the Taliban, either we do these other things right instead of just relying on the military, we are doing a great disservice to the people of Afghanistan and the people of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. Dr. Bera of California.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. You know, along with the Chairwoman, as she mentioned, last week we had the ability to meet with First Lady Ghani and First Lady Laura Bush to discuss some of the problems that are facing women and girls in Afghanistan, but also to discuss some of the successes. One thing I think we can be proud of as a nation is that investment in a generation of girls By USAID's own statistics, USAID has helped support 3.5 million girls in school and has helped increase the number of female health workers in Afghanistan. In 2002, only 25% of the health facilities had a female health worker. In 2015, 85% do. That's something we can be proud about. As a few of my colleagues have indicated, though, as we start to change our mission in Afghanistan, we've got to look at regional partners. And it'd be difficult for us to think about budgets with Afghanistan and Pakistan without talking about India as well, and India's ability to create some stability in the region. I look forward to the testimony and look forward to thinking about India's role in that region. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yield back.
Mr. Kinzinger is recognized.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and to the guests. Thank you for being here. It's going to be a good hearing. I just think Michael Waltz, who's a friend of mine, he was a Green Beret in Afghanistan and wrote a good book. He made the point that at the moment, the prior administration announced a surge in Afghanistan but had an end date on it. He said at that point, the conversation he was having with the locals ended because they basically said, look, we really like Americans, we like you here, but we know you're leaving now. And it really set our policy back quite a bit. I think this president coming forward and saying we're not going to be defeated in Afghanistan, people know that, I think we all know that we won't be defeated on the battlefield. The only time we'll be defeated is with our will. If that happens. And look, Afghanistan's not going to be a smiley unicorn facility if we leave. It's going to be even worse, and we're going to see another 9/11 type attack being planned. Unfortunately, we're finding ourselves engaged in a generational war on terror that I think will last the rest of my life. I wish it was different, but it's the reality. So, Madam Chair, I appreciate you doing this, and I look forward to all the great insights from our guests.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kinzinger. Ambassador Wagner.
I thank our esteemed chairman for organizing the hearing today. The president said in his August speech on South Asia that, and I quote, "We can no longer be silent about Pakistan's safe havens for terrorist organizations." And he made clear that the U.S. would fulfill its mission in Afghanistan and give commanders the green light to target terrorist and criminal organizations. I welcome the President's policy change on Afghanistan and Pakistan and look forward to working with the administration on improving the U.S. security approach in South Asia. However, I believe that any policy and funding upheavals should include intentional inclusion of civil society organizations and serious reform of the IMET program with Pakistan to emphasize human rights and good governance. I thank you, and I look forward to your statements, and I thank the chair.
Thank you so much, Madam Ambassador. Does any member wish to seek recognition? Seeing no other members seeking recognition, I'm delighted to finally introduce our witnesses. Thank you for your patience with the rescheduling. We're delighted to welcome Ambassador Alice Wells, the Acting Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs, and the Acting Special Representatives for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Prior to serving in this position, she served as the United States Ambassador to Jordan, Special Assistant to the President for Russia and Central Asia, and Executive Assistant to Secretary of State Clinton. Thank you for your lifelong service, and we look forward to your testimony, Ambassador Wells. I'm also delighted to welcome Dr. Gregory Huger, who serves as USAID's Assistant to the Administrator for the Office of Afghanistan and Pakistan Affairs. Mr. Huger has served in various capacities within USAID, including Pakistan Deputy Mission Director, Afghanistan Senior Development Advisor in Regional Command East, and Mission Director for Ukraine and Egypt. Thank you for being here. We also look forward to your testimony. As I said, your written statement will be made a part of the record, and please feel free to summarize. We will begin with you, Ambassador Wells. Thank you.
Chairwoman Ros-Lehtinen, Chairman Yoho, Ranking Member Deutsch, Ranking Member Sherman, and members, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the administration's strategy for South Asia. At the top of my testimony, I want to recognize and thank the thousands of U.S. servicemen and women, diplomats, development specialists, intelligence professionals, and international partners who are working every day to enhance our collective security. I've submitted the longer written testimony for the record, but here today I would like to emphasize a few points about our approach to the region. For Afghanistan, it is conditions-based. The President has made clear that our troop presence will be driven by conditions on the ground and not arbitrary timelines or troop ceilings, and that the ultimate goal is a political settlement that stabilizes Afghanistan and denies sanctuary to those who threaten us. The Taliban will come to understand that the United States has the resolve to deny them success on the battlefield, and their best option is a negotiated political settlement with the Afghan government. The Afghan leadership has welcomed the President's recommitment and recognizes that the strategy cannot succeed unless the Afghan government does its part. During the Secretary's October visit to Afghanistan, President Ghani and CEO Dr. Abdullah briefed on the ambitious reform goals endorsed in the Kabul Compact, including measures to fight corruption, promote the private sector, combat ghost soldiers and police, and ensure the integrity of the electoral process. Credible elections in 2018 and 2019 will demonstrate to the Afghan people and the Taliban that the central government represents the hopes and aspirations of all Afghans. Our rock-solid commitment to Afghanistan's security provides the time and space for Afghanistan to build its political future. Our strategy is also regional in nature. A sustainable solution to the conflict in Afghanistan requires more than just a responsible and democratic Afghan government. It requires the collective efforts of Afghanistan's neighbors and the international community. To be economically healthy and politically secure, Afghanistan must be anchored in a region that respects territorial integrity and sovereignty, promotes government stability, and works towards economic prosperity. In October, we restarted the Quadrilateral Coordination Group, convening Afghanistan, Pakistan, China, and the United States to discuss a path toward reconciliation in Afghanistan. We will vigorously pursue international and regional efforts to build broad support among the region to increase pressure on the Taliban to come to the negotiating table. Pakistan, of course, is a central part of our strategy. On the one hand, it has suffered greatly from terrorism and has fought back against militants intent on undermining the Pakistani government. We recognize the sacrifices that Pakistan has made and its progress against some of these terror groups. Pakistan has been a partner with us in the past when they helped decimate al-Qaeda, and Pakistan is cooperating with us in our efforts to disrupt ISIS. But we look to Pakistan to ensure that its territory is not a safe haven for the Taliban, Haqqani network, and other groups seeking to destabilize the region. We have also called on Pakistan to use its influence to create the conditions that will bring the Taliban to the negotiating table. Pakistan's support in securing the release of Caitlin Coleman, her husband Joshua Boyle, and their 3 children from captivity showed what we can accomplish when we work in partnership. Indeed, a Pakistani officer was injured while pursuing the hostage takers. However, the fact that the Coleman-Boyle family was in Pakistani territory highlights that Pakistan still has much to do to meet its commitment to take action against all terrorists without discrimination. As long as terrorists continue to operate within Pakistan's borders, they pose a threat to Pakistan's own stability, as well as to the security of American citizens and service members in the region. Pakistan has said that it is committed to the war on terrorism and seeks a strong relationship with the United States. We look for tangible evidence that Pakistan is adopting an indiscriminate posture against groups that threaten the region's stability, including the Taliban, the Haqqani network, Lashkar-e-Taiba, and Jaish-e-Mohammed. The Secretary conveyed specific requests on how Pakistan could make this happen, and he made clear that if Pakistan decides not to meet these requests, we will adjust our strategy accordingly. Pakistan has made important commitments to improve relations with Afghanistan. Afghanistan reasonably asks that the Taliban insurgents be forced to fight on Afghanistan soil without recourse to safe haven, respite, and regeneration in neighboring states. Finally, our strategy prioritizes the reduction of tension between India and Pakistan, which drives much of Pakistan's security calculus. On his trip to the region, Secretary Tillerson encouraged India and Pakistan to keep channels of communication open. The region and the world looks to both countries to safeguard against a nuclear conflict in South Asia. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to a candid conversation today.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Wells. Mr. Huger.
Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, Chairman Yoho, Ranking Member Deutsch.
My Congresswoman from my home district in St. Louis, Congresswoman Wagner, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me here to discuss the administration's plans for USAID assistance to Afghanistan and Pakistan under the South Asia strategy. It's an honor to appear before you with Acting Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asia, Ambassador Alice Wells, to discuss U.S. assistance that supports our national security. I want to begin by thanking, as the ambassador did, the men and women who have served in the U.S. military and our civilian agencies and their families who served and sacrificed in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and the thousands of Afghan and Pakistani citizens who have served alongside us. As was said, I bring to this position, in which I've held for 2 months, experience within USAID and in Afghanistan and Pakistan, 5 years on the border, 3 of them based in Bagram, covering eastern Afghanistan, and 2 of them working Fatah and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa through the consulate in Peshawar. In the 2 months that I've been in this position, I've had the opportunity to travel to Pakistan and Afghanistan to meet our staff and many of our local counterparts, many of whom I have known for years. When I went to Afghanistan, I was the head of the U.S. delegation to the senior officials meeting, which was the Afghan government meeting with representatives of 38 countries that support Afghanistan, meeting to review progress over the year since commitments to support Afghanistan's development were made in Brussels. My takeaway from that meeting was that we do have a real partner in the national unity government. President Ghani was very articulate in his praise of the South Asia strategy. That was shared by his team as well as the representatives from the other countries attending the meeting. His focus was on shifting from donor assistance to private investment as a long-term solution for Afghanistan, and in that context, addressing corruption and the other impediments to the functioning of a market economy in Afghanistan, including, of course, security. He also, together with his wife, First Lady, emphasized the importance of the empowerment of women, and 1/3 of the conference was spent on that subject. My takeaway from my visit of last week to Pakistan, including visits to Islamabad, Peshawar, and Karachi, was the strong support for the mainstreaming of Fatah in a way that is not yet clearly articulated, but which seems to be a priority for political parties, military, and the citizens more broadly. And I was very pleased to see the strong support in civil society for the effort to give resilience to communities to resist extremism, particularly among the youth. Now, in Afghanistan, and we'll talk more about this, I'm sure, we're focused on 3 points: helping sustain the gains in health, education, and women's empowerment, helping build stronger bonds between the government and the citizens through service delivery, credible elections, and reduced corruption, and through supporting increased private sector investment, particularly in the market areas or the larger urban areas, to create opportunity for the people and revenue for the government. In Pakistan, we're focused on 3 main points. First, normalizing the border area, stabilizing the border area. And that includes mainstreaming Fatah in whatever way the Pakistanis decide to do it, and reincorporating these people who have returned. The second is supporting communities to become resilient to violent extremism. The third is to support private sector investment to create opportunities for the youth bulge. Thank you for having me here. I'm delighted to be here and look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much to both of you for your patience and for being here. Ambassador Wells, it was reported last week that there is a proposal on the table to have the Office of the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan in the White House. The report also confirmed that the actual office had been dissolved at state, with duties and functions fully integrated into the SCA Bureau. Do you have any update on that decision? That would seem to many of us that SAID is no longer a key player when it comes to Afghanistan and Pakistan.
I'm not aware of a measure to move SRAP to the White House, but within the State Department, we have completed a reintegration, a combination of the South and Central Asian Bureau with the Afghanistan and Pakistan office. And this has been an initiative that the State Department has sought since 2016. It reflects very much this administration's view that the answer to Afghanistan is a regional one, that we have to look beyond the stovepipe of AFPAC and understand how the region as a whole is going to contribute to the stabilization.
Thank you. Well, please keep us updated on any moves that way. Thank you very much. Dr. Baer and I were happy to host First Lady Ghani and First Lady Bush and many members of the U.S. Afghan Women's Council last week, and they expressed gratitude for the assistance from the United States, particularly with the investment that we have made together in women's programs. But they suggested that we begin thinking about more long-term planning rather than implementing short-term programs. USAID has its Promote program that recognizes the important role that women will have in Afghanistan's future. With Promote now about halfway through its 5-year mandate, are we starting to plan for the next iteration using what we have learned to help inform the next stage when Promote ends for more long-term programming, Mr. Huger?
Yes, we are.
Thank you very much. Poppy cultivation. A lot of us have discussed it. Up again last year, eradication down drastically. Afghanistan produces about 75% of the world's opium. And not only does this cause a serious health crisis, but it also provides a great deal of funding for terrorists and incentivizes corruption and crime. Yet the budget request for Afghanistan for the International Narcotics Control and Law Enforcement counter-narcotics effort was nearly cut in half to about $44 million from the nearly $80 million in fiscal year 2016 actuals. How can we justify this great reduction in the request for the International Narcotics Control and Law Enforcement counter-narcotics program when we know that production is up and we know that terror groups fund their activities from drug trafficking?
There's a relationship between drug production and security, and right now the overwhelming majority of hectares of opium grown is under Taliban control or in contested areas. And so critical to our efforts to counter narcotics are going to be to resolve the essential conflict with the Taliban. The reason you've seen a decline in funding under INL for counter-narcotics is because over the years we have managed to build a capacity within the government of Afghanistan. We have stood up under the Ministry of Interior a counter-narcotics police force. There are 2 specialized units that are also working in close coordination and training with the DEA. And so we want to see a shift because we're not there for permanent nation building. This is about building the Afghanistan capacity. I think in terms of strategy right now, the idea is not to go after the lowest person on the food chain, the farmer, but to go after the processing centers and the facilities that are the next level up, because it is critical to disrupt Taliban financing.
Thank you so much. I have another question about infrastructure projects, but I know we have Nikki Haley coming in at noon, so I'll yield back the balance of my time and turn to Mr. Deutsch, the ranking member.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Since 2001, the United States has provided over $100 billion in economic and security assistance to Afghanistan. Can you comment on what you believe are the most important outcomes of this aid in the areas of economic development, gender equality, human rights, education, health, democracy, the rule of law? What are the most important security accomplishments from this aid? What have we gotten for $100 billion? Both of you, please.
If I could begin answering from the USAID perspective. As you said in your introductory comments, the progress in education, particularly of girls, has been very important. Very difficult, but very important. and that's something that we will continue. The effort that Chairman Ros-Lehtinen mentioned in the Promote program, which is focused on 85,000 women who have at least a high school education, to help them play important roles in business, in civil society, and in government, has gotten off to a very good start. The infrastructure efforts that we have made, challenging as they have been, have produced a road transportation network that meets minimum requirements of the country, if maintained. We have made contributions to the production, distribution of electric power, and we've helped Afghanistan make significant gains in health, where, though there is a long way to go, health care is available to a very large number of Afghans when it was not before. These and many other concrete accomplishments are the result of our work in Afghanistan. It's definitely a work in progress. It's definitely facing opposition, but it's definitely worth continuing to achieve the outcomes envisaged in the South Asia strategy.
Thanks. Ambassador Wells, I'm going to go a slightly different direction in my remaining time. I think it's safe to say that the members on this dais all agree that there's no purely military solution to the war, and therefore reconciliation of some sort is ultimately going to be needed. The President said, perhaps it will be possible to have a political settlement that includes elements of the Taliban in Afghanistan. Can you tell us what that political settlement would look like for the administration's perspective, and what would the key impediments to the Taliban seeking to participate in the reconciliation process be, and is there any way for Taliban to be a part of this that wouldn't jeopardize Afghan human rights?
The administration has always said not preconditions to negotiations, but end conditions. And the end conditions have been a cessation of violence, a cessation of ties to terrorist networks, and respect for the Constitution, including the provisions for women and minorities. And that continues to be the case. This is going to be, there is necessarily going to have to be an Afghan conversation. President Trump was very clear that we're not there to micromanage how Afghans decide among themselves to live and to regulate their political life. And so I think this has been a remarkably open approach by successive administrations, including the Trump administration. The impediments are, foremost, the unwillingness to date of the Taliban to enter into negotiations with the government of Afghanistan, whether privately or publicly. And so the challenge right now, the question is not whether we're prepared to support, an Afghan-led and owned peace process. We are, and we've said that. And Secretary Tillerson has been quite explicit that there is a role and a place at the table for moderate Taliban, and we look for them to join this process. The task right now is how do we get the Taliban to the negotiating table? And there's two parts to that. There has to be increased military pressure. For the last 4 years, they were waiting for us to leave. Not unreasonably, given that that was the policy of the prior administration. But second, there has to be political pressure and coordinated international pressure on the Taliban. And that includes ensuring that the Taliban Political Commission in Doha is doing its essential function, which is facilitating, peace negotiations.
Well, thank you. I yield back. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mr. Deutsch. Dr. Yoho is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ambassador Wells, earlier this week, the President issued a budget amendment with respect to the DoD budget. It called for additional funding for troops. He made it clear that he will not talk about troop levels, but that we will ask our NATO allies and global partners to increase their troop levels to support us. Does NATO have the level of troops it has deemed necessary for the Afghan mission?
Our NATO partners have been interesting in working with us to ensure the success of the South Asia strategy.
I'm sure they're interested, but have they increased the level of commitment since the change of leadership in our country?
Yeah, we're confident that we're going to get increased levels of support from our NATO partners.
All right, but as of yet, you've not seen that?
No, the process is ongoing, and we're confident that we're going to see that increased support.
Okay, and then you've answered my second question too then. Is the current request for $1.13 billion for Afghanistan and Pakistan enough to implement this new strategy that we have?
Yes, we believe that the $780 million approximately for Afghanistan is an appropriate sum. It represents about an 18% reduction from our previous request, but continues to build out in the essential 3 areas that Mr. Huger identified as being the pillars of our approach.
And the normalizing and stabilizing border areas, resilient communities, and the private sector investments, you both agree that's where we need to focus on?
Yes, from a State Department perspective, very much so. And from the President's speech, the idea that this is not a blank check, that we need to help Afghanistan shift from a donor economy to a private sector fueled economy.
I'm glad to hear you say it is not a blank check. You know, I got in front of me, and Mr. Huger, I'm going to come to you. Pakistan is among the leading recipients of U.S. foreign assistance in post-9/11 period. Congress appropriated more than $33 billion in assistance from 2002 to 2016, including $10.5 billion in economic development and humanitarian aid. In addition, there was an extra $14 billion in CSF funding, which is the Coalition Support Fund. When I look at that kind of an investment, you know, I always wonder what kind of return on investment did we get? And so I think one of the things that we can do is look at approval ratings. And it's interesting to me, with that kind of money that the American taxpayers have allowed to be spent by the people in government, in 2015, 22% people that were polled in Pakistan viewed the United States positively, 22%. And I guess we should be excited about that because that's up from 14% in 2014. That's about where Congress is. That's according to the Pew Research. However, the thing I find interesting is 78% of the Pakistanis polled viewed China favorably, with only 3% responding unfavorably. You said you've been in that region for 5 to 6 years. What are we doing to change our tactics to get a better response for the money that the American taxpayers are spending?
Thank you, Congressman Yoho, for the question. It's a very important
I'm going to report this back to Lauren.
Yes, indeed. The focus of our strategy is in the national security interest of the United States, and going forward, to identify things that are also in the national security interest of Pakistan. It's not a popularity contest at a popular level where from one month to the next, the polling would show what percentage of people love or hate us. It's about our national security, which is tangentially related to the popularity, but not directly. So our focus on helping secure the border, helping Pakistan, as it seems to want to do now, to find a way to mainstream that ungoverned space called Fatah into the province of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, or in whatever way they want to do it, is absolutely transformational from a historic perspective. Making that a success, and with it, helping to reabsorb or reintegrate 1.6 million people who were displaced by conflict from Fatah and are now coming back, 85% are back, the rest will be returning. Those are things that would make a different Pakistan. That's good for Pakistan, that's good for us, that's good for the region. So it's not a popularity contest, it's about national security of the United States and the countries where we're working.
I appreciate you, Ambassador Welsh.
If I could just add, you know, these polls capture something, and oftentimes it's a response to a policy issue that Pakistanis disagree with. But if you ask Pakistanis, where do you want to study? Where would you like to work? Where would you like to get medical care? I mean, the pull of America and the West is quite strong. And I think as we, continue our engagement with Pakistan, it's really about how does Pakistan want to be a member of this international community, and the expectations that not only we hold, but our international partners hold in asking Pakistan to take these specific steps to combat terrorism.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Yoho. And we're so pleased that our subcommittees have been joined by the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Elliot Engel of New York, and I'm very pleased to yield whatever time he may consume to him right now. Thank you, Mr. Engel.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank you, and I want to thank Mr. Yoho and also Mr. Sherman, Mr. Deutsch, for letting me participate today and making a statement. I wanted to ask Ambassador Wells a few questions, and Ambassador, thank you for your service and for your time this morning. I want to talk about Afghanistan, because we are 16 years into the war there. After all that time, this conflict obviously remains one of our most important foreign policy priorities, and there's an enormous amount at stake, obviously, for our country, for Afghanistan, and for the region. In August, President Trump announced his South Asia strategy at Fort Myer, Virginia. He told the world that we will win and that we will defeat them and defeat them handily. It was a lot of tough talk, but it really left me with more questions than answers, because we don't know the details. We don't know how this plan will bring the conflict to an end, and I want to just talk about that. I voted for all the AUMFs back in 2001, 2002, and I'm really very much chagrined that we're still operating on that. We should have this Congress attack foreign policy and do what's right, rather than relying on a Congress when I was here, but I would venture to say 80 to 90% of the members still here or were not here back then. So I have some questions. Madam Ambassador, is the administration's position that the war in Afghanistan will come to an end by a military victory won on the battlefield?
No, victory is a sustainable political settlement that results in a stable Afghanistan whose territory is not used to threaten the United States and our partners. Sir, I had the opportunity to accompany the Secretary on his trip to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, and there I was able to see, the impact of the strategy in each of those countries. For Afghanistan, it is a recommitment to that country, the knowledge that we're prepared to stay with them as they have to undertake what are very difficult and necessary reforms. It's telling the Pakistanis that we're not leaving, it's not 1989, that you need to count on our presence, and instead of hedging, identify how to mediate the legitimate interests that you have in Afghanistan at a negotiating table. And in India, it's recognizing the positive role that India can play in Afghanistan's economic stabilization. And so I found across the region, the strategy was extraordinarily resonant. And I do believe that after 4 years of counting us out, we have changed the dynamic and we've changed the conversation, and we're going to see progress as a result.
So thank you. Let me ask you this. Has the administration provided American troops in Afghanistan additional authorities beyond the train, advise, and equip mission, essentially putting them back into more of a combat role?
The mission is still a train, advise, and equip. I think both Secretary Mattis and the President have made mention to authorities being provided that will allow for more aggressive targeting. That's not really my area of expertise, so I had to defer to my defense colleagues. But the number of troops, the commitment of our troops, and the ability of our troops to actively and aggressively assist the Afghan forces will make a difference.
Well, Secretary Tillerson said this is a war that will come to an end through a negotiated settlement. He said, we will not win, but the Taliban won't win either. If that's true, why are we then sending more troops to Afghanistan?
As Secretary Mattis testified, and I believe General Nicholson, the conflict had been a stalemate, generally in favor of the government, but a stalemate. And it had not, the Taliban have not yet been convinced that they're not going to win on the battlefield. And so the provision of additional forces to enhance the train, advise, and assist and to push it down to a lower level, we believe is going to be quite significant in making a difference on the battlefield, along with the additional air assets that are being provided. And so, as I said at the outset, the key impediment to achieving a peaceful negotiated settlement is the unwillingness to date of the Taliban to engage directly with the government of Afghanistan. We have to change that calculus of the Taliban using both military and political means.
You mentioned earlier that the administration believes the war will come to an end through a negotiation. So let me ask you, what is the administration doing to prepare for this negotiation, and why aren't we more focused on touting a potential peace process?
We remain very active in all of the regional architectures that have existed and have been developed to reinforce a message of, that supports a negotiated political solution. I just recently hosted a quadrilateral meeting with the Chinese, the Afghans, and the Pakistanis. I look forward to participating in the Heart of Asia conference that's coming up, the Kabul process. There's an international contact group. There are a variety of diplomatic initiatives that continue to work very closely. But fundamentally, we need to get the parties to agree to talk to one another directly, and that involves changing the Taliban's calculus. We also believe, I also believe that we need to improve the relationship between Afghanistan and Pakistan to see better cooperation between the two countries. And so we've been supportive of General Bajwa, Chief of Army Staff's recent visit to Kabul, his commitment to undertake specific initiatives with his Afghan counterparts. So at a variety of levels, bilaterally, trilaterally, and in larger international groupings, we are pursuing this effort, sir.
I don't believe that we should cut and run in Afghanistan. I don't believe that we shouldn't care about what happens there. Obviously, it's very important, but I think you can understand that many of us are worried about getting bogged down in a situation where we can't get out and use it more and more as justification. And as the years go on, and we're still going back to an AUMF that's old and antiquated. And by the way, I said this under the previous administration, not only under this administration, I would say it under any administration. I do think Congress has to play a much more important role. We are a co-equal branch of government, and we should be playing a more important role if indeed the effect of our policy is going to be to wear us down and keep us there in a war that we cannot win, that admittedly we cannot win. You know, what changes? What changes 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now?
And I think the steps that the government of Afghanistan is taking and needs to take to enhance its inclusivity, to make itself a more attractive partner, to demonstrate that the central government is representative of all the Afghan people is critical. And so, both President Ghani and Dr. Abdullah, when they met with Secretary Tillerson, discussed the Kabul Compact, the 200 metrics that the Afghans themselves have developed to be able to measure specific reforms across the fields of economics, governance, security, and reconciliation are an important symbol of the fact that with President Ghani and Dr. Abdullah, we do have partners that we can work with in this effort at reform.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We're honored by your presence, and thank you for the questions. And I would like to recognize Ambassador Wagner to take over our part of the subcommittee, joint subcommittee hearing. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrbacher, for 5 minutes for questioning.
The American people have every right to be concerned when we are talking about putting more troops into Afghanistan, considering the fact that we have been there as long as we have and been suffering casualties. The 2,400 dead does not include the wounded that we have had in Afghanistan, which is a tremendous cost to families across our country. And I think that it behooves decision makers, if they are going to try to use military force as a political tool, achieving political ends, that we are also looking at what is necessary for that to succeed. Let me just note that I am not as great an expert as probably either one of you are, but I do have a long history in Afghanistan, and the Constitution of Afghanistan, as far as I can see, and people I know who are totally immersed in Afghan culture, the Constitution we've foisted on these people is totally contrary to their culture. Say, centralized in Kabul power, when in fact Afghanistan has the most decentralized social framework of any country I know. I mean, it goes right down to the village level, village, family, tribal, and then provincial and ethnic, and then way back up to Kabul. Are we going to be making any changes in the Constitution that so far has not succeeded?
If I could start on the question of the use of military force, I agree with you, sir. It is an awesome responsibility. The troops that are going in today are performing a very different function. It is a train, advise, and assist function. It's not
I'd like an
combat
answer to my
function.
question.
Absolutely.
Are we doing, is there
On the
going to be any reform
Constitution-
of the Constitution and the way the government works?
The Constitution is an Afghanistan document.
We
It was
foisted that
embraced-
on them. I was there when we did.
And it was endorsed by Loya Jirga, but underneath the Constitution, within the Constitution, there is the ability for the Afghan government to amend its Constitution. It can follow its own constitutional
Are there moves
processes
to do that? Are there efforts to do that?
I'm not aware that there are
Obviously, the
efforts now.
Constitution has not worked to create a better Afghanistan because we're talking about sending more troops into Afghanistan. Let me ask this. 15 years ago, we developed a fungus that could be dropped from the air and would affect only the poppy plants and would eliminate the poppy production for not only that year, but for 10 years. But it would affect no other crop. Are you aware of that?
I'm not aware of the program.
Are you aware of that? Well, let me just note.
No, sir, I'm not.
Let me note for the record, I have stated this publicly, stated in hearings like this. Obviously, our government has not been willing to stop the poppy production. That's a major source of revenue for those people who've been killing and maiming our Americans, soldiers who've gone to Afghanistan. As far as Pakistan, let me ask you this about Pakistan. So you stated Pakistan has been our partner. You mentioned partner.
In combating al-Qaeda and currently in combating ISIS, we have worked closely with Pakistan and achieved significant results. Okay. Historically, you know the Cold War history, but more recently, there are elements of partnership and then elements of extreme disagreement, which is the focus of the South Asia strategy today.
Yeah, let me just note that when 9/11, which got us all involved in this, 9/11, I think there were 2 Afghans involved in 9/11, and the rest were Saudis, and it was planned in Pakistan. And, you know, we've had, as I say, the suffering. The Pakistani people are suffering under their own government, and I think before we commit more troops to that part of the world, we should certainly see changes in the way those areas are governed, or all we're doing is condemning more people to die and to be maimed. Madam Chairman, this is a very serious issue, and we know we're up against radical Islam, but we can't just solve it by thinking, I don't buy any of the reforms that you've been talking about are going to make any difference in Afghanistan, because you haven't gone to the heart of what isn't working. And if we just send more troops, we're going to have more dead bodies, and it doesn't make sense to me.
The gentleman's time's expired. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the Asia Subcommittee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, for 5 minutes.
Ambassador, in private conversations with the Pakistani leaders, do they tacitly admit that at least elements of their government were aware where bin Laden was? Or do they stick to the talking point that, oh, we were looking for him, every element of the Pakistani government was looking for him, we just couldn't find him? How honest are they?
Sir, I've never heard any Pakistani leader suggest that Pakistan knew where Osama bin Laden was located.
And they tend to suggest that they were looking real hard and they just couldn't find him. Since 2001, we've provided over $100 billion of economic and security assistance to Afghanistan, not to mention the blood and treasure of fighting the war, and $20 billion of economic assistance and military assistance to Pakistan. I want to focus a little bit on human rights. The Human Rights Commission of Pakistan reported over 700 people were disappeared, kidnapped, never heard of again, and that's just in 2016. Elements of the Pakistani government and military just see it as a good political tactic to cause their opponents to disappear. Ambassador, I'd like to get you to focus on one particular incident. 2 years ago, November 2015, Sindhi leader Dr. Anwar Laghari was brutally murdered in Pakistan. The Pakistani government has not been responsive to numerous inquiries about that murder. And he was murdered while he was conducting political activities. His perpetrators have not been brought to justice. Days before his death, he had sent a memorandum to the U.S. government about human rights violations by Pakistani security forces. But now here's the new information. Just a few days ago, Dr. Anwar Laghari's son, Asad Laghari, was found dead in suspicious circumstances, very possibly poisoned. I had met with Asad Laghari when he was in Washington. He was pursuing a master's degree at Mehran University of Engineering and Technology at its U.S.-Pakistan Center for Advanced Studies in Water. What's suspicious about this is that Asad Laghari's death comes just weeks after I had, along with 6 other members of this House, sent a letter focusing on human rights issues in Sindh. And that letter especially focused on disappearances, murders, extrajudicial killings. To what extent does the administration take up these human rights issues and disappearances with the Pakistani government? And to what extent has the issue of human rights and disappearances in Sindh raised at the recent visits to Pakistan by yourself and by Secretary Tillerson?
Sir, we regularly raise human rights situation in Pakistan. As you know, our human rights report on Pakistan is quite candid about the disappearances, the other abuses that we see, and that organizations inside of Pakistan, including journalists and human rights organizations themselves, document. And so this is a serious concern.
Did Secretary Tillerson bring this up directly and orally in his conversations?
I'm not able to comment on whether he brought them up directly, but I can assure you, sir, that we bring them up directly, the ambassador and the consulate.
Can I ask you to personally bring up with high-level Pakistani authorities the November 2015 death of Dr. Anwar Laghari and the death just a few weeks ago of Dr. Laghari's son, Asad Laghari?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Shifting to Pakistan, any chance that the doctor who helped us, I believe his name is pronounced Dr. Ahmadi, is going to be released?
We continue to raise Dr. Afridi's case.
Afridi, excuse me.
In every high-level encounter, and we have not yet seen the Pakistani government move to do so. As you know, we have withheld $100 million in assistance as a result of his continued incarceration.
Not enough. Let's do more. I bring up for the record the issue of Ahmadi Muslim. Sorry for the mispronunciation. But I want to pick up on Dana Rohrbacher's point. Is it the policy of the United States in Afghanistan to destroy poppy crops to the full extent that that can be done without destroying legitimate agriculture?
The destruction of poppy crops is always sensitive, and our policy has always been to support the destruction of poppy crops in areas where local leaders agree to this strategy. For most local leaders, this is difficult because of who is impacted most directly, which is the local farmer. So, sir, I recognize the concern. It is a tension. But at this stage, the overwhelming majority of poppy is being produced in Taliban-controlled and Taliban-contested areas. The Taliban has become addicted to the drug trade, which is why we do need to go after the next higher level of
It's
drug
hard to go
facilities.
back to my district and say we died by the thousands to protect poppy farmers that are sending heroin to the United States because that's the crop that they prefer to grow, and we don't want to be unpopular with them.
But we are, sir, working very closely with the police forces, the counter-narcotics police forces, and the two specialized units that we help set up to target the next level up quite aggressively in order to try to disrupt
Gentleman's
the
time's
financing.
expired.
Yeah.
Chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. I say welcome to the witnesses, especially Mr. Huger, who hails from Missouri's 2nd Congressional District and is a Priory graduate, and your daughter's a graduate of my alma mater, so welcome, sir. The continued involvement of the Pakistan military in the civilian government is damaging to the country. Assistant Secretary Wells, my understanding is that the fiscal year 18 request for Pakistan's IMET account is 5 times the amount request for fiscal year 16. Can you please explain this increase in IMET funding, what it'll be used for, and what the figure is, please?
IMET funding has been a useful tool for us to establish relations with members of the Pakistani military, and through those training courses to try to inculcate some of the values that we believe are essential to appropriate civilian-military relations in any country, and certainly in any democratic country.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned values, Ambassador Wells. Does the IMET program contain coursework on human rights and democracy? And I do have some concerns as to why it was increased 5 times the amount since fiscal year 16.
I would have to check on the number being a 5 times increase. I'm sorry, I can't respond to that. But traditionally, our e-IMET courses do have a very heavy component of rule of law, of respect for, of how a military operates in wartime, respect for human rights. And so, yes, that is a critical component of many of our IMET programs.
I don't believe that the program does include specific and vigorous coursework on human rights and democracy. So I would like you to
I'll take that back.
To take that back and to put forward some of the coursework. And I'd also like an exact number and some reasoning as to why it was increased 5 times from over in 18 over fiscal year 16. The administration's funding request for the International Narcotics Control and Law Enforcement Program would decrease the Afghanistan account by nearly 50% and the Pakistan account by nearly 40%. My understanding is that this account is used to support criminal justice institutions and the judicial sector, fight corruption, and reform security forces. Assistant Secretary Wells, is this how this account was used in Afghanistan and Pakistan? And what gains does the administration hope to make by cutting this program?
We've supported these programs for many years at significant amounts of funding, and have to show for it, specialized structures now, institutions that have been developed, counter-narcotics police forces that have been stood up, special investigative units that are working in conjunction with our drug enforcement agency. And so the cut in funding also reflects the idea that having stood up these institutions, we're able to transfer now the responsibility to these host government agencies while continuing to work with them in partnership.
And you believe these institutions have in fact been stood up and are in fact fighting corruption and reforming and reforms have been put in place in the security?
We have stood up these institutions. We continue to work with them and to mentor them, but the change in funding reflects a shift again towards shifting the responsibility to the host government.
I just want to make sure that we're shifting priorities, especially as I see IMET plussed up over 5 times, that we are also shifting towards increased human rights and democracy programs at all levels. Thank you. Mr. Huger, is the administration intending to reduce the democracy and governance programs that we fund in these countries, of Afghanistan and Pakistan?
We are focusing our efforts on the points that I mentioned. Within them is helped to reduce corruption and to have credible elections in Afghanistan, and to help Pakistan establish governance in the ungoverned area of FATA. FATA has had the frontier crimes regulation since 1902, when the British established it, and there is a significant will among the people in FATA to normalize their legal framework. So our emphasis on normalizing the border area will include helping the government establish local jurisdictions that can respond to the needs and desires of the population. So we intend to have a very significant focus on governance and democratic elections in both countries.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Huger. My time's expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Brooks, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I've got some comments, and I'm going to ask a question. This war began in 2001. Now it's ongoing for roughly 16 years. That is the longest active military conflict in the history of the United States. Early on, the Taliban government was toppled, and al-Qaeda, to a very large degree, was destroyed. And quite frankly, goals were achieved. Our American military won. Later on, Osama bin Laden was killed as a result of our presence in Afghanistan. Another goal was achieved, and America's military won yet again. However, we've persisted in Afghanistan despite those victories and achievements by our military, and the cost in monetary terms is estimated to be as low as $800 billion to $1 trillion, as high as $4 to $6 trillion when including, quote, long-term medical care and disability compensation for service members, veterans and families, military replenishment, and social costs, end quote, according to a study by Harvard economist Linda Baumos. Moving on, in a more difficult part of the cost, are lives lost and casualties incurred. We've had roughly, well, more than 2,000 American military personnel who have lost their lives, roughly 1,000 plus American contractors, civilians, who have been serving in this war zone who have also lost their lives, and we've had roughly 20,000 wounded American casualties, many of whom have come home with debilitating injuries. We had a protester at the beginning of this hearing, and I'm going to make some comments about him. The protester's remarks were about how long are we going to stay in Afghanistan, and quite frankly, in my judgment, those views reflect the views of a growing number of American citizens who grow justifiably weary of America's treasury spent, American lives lost, and American men and women coming home horribly injured and permanently disabled. Earlier this year, on August the 21st of 2017, the President in a speech stated, quote, "My original instinct was to pull out, and historically I like following my instinct," end quote. Someone apparently persuaded President Trump to disregard his instinct, and rather than pull out, we are now looking at a dramatic increase in our troop levels and ultimately our casualties and our costs. So I want to get back to one of the questions that was raised by an audience member. How long are we looking at before we can declare victory? We didn't do it after we toppled the Taliban and debilitated al-Qaeda. We didn't do it after Osama bin Laden was killed and justice obtained. Are you talking years? Are you talking decades? And at what cost? Ambassador Wells, in your judgment, are we talking years or are we talking decades?
I'm sorry, I can't answer that question, but I would note, as the President said in his speech, that the reason he reverted was because he was convinced that the threat to our own national security remained. And
well, okay, I'm sorry, that's not answering my question, but nonetheless, I'm going to follow up on your comment. I'm also familiar with his speech, and he's talking about terrorists, correct? So is that, please for the record, state yes, not just nod your head.
Yes.
Okay. Does that justify then us invading every single other country on the planet in which there are al-Qaeda or Islamic State forces? Is that the suggestion there, that that's the justification for still being in Afghanistan, despite this already being the longest active military engagement in the history of the United States?
Sir, I think this is specific to Afghanistan's role as being the launching pad for the attack on 9/11.
But we've killed those people.
Al-Qaeda continues to operate.
But Al-Qaeda continues to operate in at least a dozen other countries in the Middle East and in Africa and in Asia.
In Afghanistan.
But let's get back to Afghanistan more particularly. Is it your testimony that you have no judgment, no insight whatsoever on behalf of this administration that will help the American people ascertain how many more lives will be lost, how many more of our American troops will come home disabled, and how many more years we will be there, and at what great cost? You have no estimate whatsoever.
So the judgment is that there are multiple terrorist groups operating in ungoverned spaces in Afghanistan.
Okay, that's not answering my question, Ambassador Wells. My question is, do you have a judgment as to the length of time? I'm not asking for the explanation. I'm already at the end of my 5-minute remarks, but do you have an estimate of the length of time and how much more cost there's going to be to the American people with this engagement in Afghanistan?
The President's strategy specifically does not attach a calendar to this commitment.
I understand
because it will be conditions-based, and so I'm not able to answer you on how long this will take.
So it could be
We would like
decades.
to get to the negotiating table as soon as possible.
It could be decades and thousands more of American lives lost, tens of thousands more of American lives coming home disabled, and trillions of dollars spent that we don't have, can't afford to get other than by borrowing, and we can't afford to pay back. Is that your testimony?
We would like to get to the negotiating table as soon as possible.
Gentleman's time's expired.
Thank you.
Seeing no more members present in committee, I would like to thank the witnesses for their testimony here today, and I would declare the Joint Middle East and Asia Subcommittee hearing on the President's plan for Afghanistan and Pakistan adjourned.